also, communication-wise, your son, is he totally non-speaking?
He has no, I hate that word, intelligible speech, but yes, he does not have any speech. He makes a lot of noises.
Okay.
Yes, which he says, when he explains it, it's to him, it's like breathing, like it's part of what he does.
All right, and so he manages to communicate through words, and you do this sort of
Spelling,
letterboard. So he spells out the words for you, and he can create a sentence, and he can
painstakingly letter by letter.
Right.
Yeah. One of the best things I ever heard was from a course I took in Philadelphia, and I repeat this all the time, but they explained it. People confuse brain function and intelligence all the time. So if we're talking about brain function, like auditory processing and visual processing and gross motor and fine motor, there's no association to that and intelligence. But there's high correlation between brain injury or problems with brain function and the ability to express that intelligence. So, but people see the arm flapping and the noises, and some of them are very just, I guess, childlike. So they think that the mind is childlike, and it's such a dangerous assumption.
Well, you've managed to get purposeful language or communication,
yes,
which must have just been mind-blowing. Really.
That's the word. Like shocking, life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't. It's a process to get to open-ended sentences.
I'm sure it's quite frustrating for a lot of people because you can't say this is the path for this, but it's a tool, and if you're creative and you understand your child's particular profile, you can. It's the scaffolding pieces, to build.
So some people do say that there's only one particular path.
Oh,
and those are the people who advocate for their particular method.
Okay.
But my experience as a clinician and the people that work with my son that I've learned with, that is not the approach. We use whatever works.
So you've trained in a lot of different
ones, yeah.
Ones?
So
okay.
So to my understanding with the history, this started when in Syracuse in the 90s, when someone, I'm afraid I can't remember her name, but they were using physical support. I believe they were on a keyboard, and they realized that having that back pressure gave her the ability to type purposefully. When later on, a woman named Soma, I can't remember her last name. She has a difficult Indian last name, but this brilliant woman, she was working with her son, Tito, who's also non-speaking autism, and she created her own method, and she called it rapid prompting method, RPM. And she kind of, I'm not sure if she knew even about the facilitated communication, or FC is what they called it before, but she began incorporating, she kind of extended it to start help working on independent pointing. And she created these stencils, which is a really brilliant idea. So these plastic stencils with the letters cut out, and so the person would hold a pencil and you poke through. And the purpose of that is to give some sensory feedback, kind of like a keyboard, but keyboards are smaller and there's smaller buttons. And so this was larger, kind of the same idea. And she also incorporated choices, pointing to choices, which is very powerful and helpful method of
such a simple,
but
opens up
totally
opens up that first moment of communication.
That's what I used at first, and even to know, like, my son would be crying, and I didn't know what was wrong, and just to know he's hungry or in pain.
Yeah, so you can write down hungry, pain.
Yes,
and as long as he can purposefully point.
Yes,
you're going to get a little piece of information.
And you can drill down, right? If it's pain, you say, okay, is it in your head, your stomach, your legs? And if he says, legs or something, then you just drill down.
I know. That's so simple. And until you realize that pointing is also a learned skill.
Right.
Like
it can be, and choices more so than spelling are can be unreliable. So, but it's a learned skill, and there's ways to validate the choice.
Okay.
So one of the simple ways is you well, for one thing, a purposeful point will be slow. Usually the eyes will coordinate. It won't be like just a random quick point.
Okay.
And then you can flip the board. If you have choices, say 4 quadrants, flip the board. And if they give, now they're pointing to their original choice, and you can flip it again sideways. And so you can validate. You have confidence.
Yeah.
And we practice, I would, for 2 or 3 weeks, I practiced with known choices with my son. So I would give him some information. I would ask him a question that there was only one answer to. We practiced. Again, you have to look at it through the motor lens. You're not practicing the cognitive skill of thinking of the answer. But that's a good point too. The cognitive and the motor balance. So this is why you can't start off a person with asking them, expecting them to respond to a question that requires some thought and they're a hard motor skill. It would be like you and I learn, when you learn to drive and you're tense and you can't even listen to the radio or talk to someone, but that's what you're asking them to do. You're asking them to learn to drive and answer a question at the same time. Too much. So you have to be aware of that.
So you work on the physical skill first,
and then you can slowly,
and then increasing the challenge of the
to add into the cognitive
part.
Or there's ways you can kind of diagram if you ask more. So for example, a laminate letterboard, like a flat letterboard laminate, is more difficult than the stencils, than a 26 stencil board. So if you wanted to ask a more challenging question, they were on the laminate, you could go back to the stencil and
so you often validate the answers, because I can imagine that there's always until they get to spelling, and then there's so many letters that go in a sequence, so you know that if it's created a word, it's probably the word that they want.
You do because you don't want to get. To be honest, it can be easy to get into the habit of interpreting for them, and you don't want that. You want to actually encourage them to take responsibility for their message. And even if let's say they're spelling something, and with there's so many letter combinations in English, at least, that you can word prediction, right? You can tell. You get them to finish, because I'll give you the best example.
Okay, to finish off the word.
Yeah, but one time, this is a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, he woke up really early, just too early, and he couldn't go back to sleep. So I said, "Do you want to watch a movie?" And he spelled water, and I stopped and I got him some water, and he was upset. And so I tried again, and he spelled water, and I thought that was weird. I'm like, I got this. Maybe you want cold water. So I got him cold water, and then he threw the cup, and then I finally thought to let him finish, and he spelled Watership down.
I was going to say it's something to do with the title of the book.
I didn't even know. He knew. He told me later that I had mentioned it before. But my son has told me he will want when he said the words once, he's crying inside, but he's not crying outwardly.
Oh wow!
But the opposite is true too. Once we were watching something, he was really interested in this space thing. He just started sobbing. I'm like, "What's wrong?" He's like, "Nothing. Don't just ignore it." I was like, "Oh, it's very bizarre." But
wow,
one of the parent friends used to this is opposite land, but it is sometimes their bodies will literally do the opposite of what is going on inside them, and so I don't trust. It's kind of weird language to use, but I can't trust my son's facial expressions. Well, sometimes, because I'm his mom and I know him, but I've got it wrong so many times that the best way is when I'm certain of his communication. That's what I rely on. I can't rely on what his body's doing, because it's not what he wants all the time.
Well, it's such an amazing thing to hear you say has been your experience, and I think people need to hear a lot of that, because so many assumptions are made, and
Wrong assumptions.
yeah, and you've reached a place where you can validate, like you can get a little more information. And yeah, I always felt like I want a crystal ball. I remember when she was tiny, it's like, if only I had a crystal ball and I knew what was
that ache of like not knowing how to help them when you can see something's wrong. It's awful.
Yeah,
It's really, and it still happens because sometimes when my son is dysregulated, which is the hardest for him to communicate, but it's also when the most we need it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just have to wait. We went for years where people had the cognitive paradigm of autism, and it is shifting, but it's not fast enough for me and not fast enough for them. A boy in my son's class, he wrote this beautiful poem, but what the line that like it's stuck with me in my brain is there's an anaphora poem where he started off the same line, but the line was, I've heard what the doctors said about my brain, and I've heard my mom believe them. And he said that memory came when he was like 5 years old. So they didn't find the communication or the letterboard until he was like 14. So
there's a group that is so cognitively aware of everything
trapped
going
in their
on,
bodies.
but trapped in their body.
This is no different than any other locked-in syndrome. But for ALS or stroke, we know that they had communication before that, so we don't assume now there's nothing there. But with these guys who are born with, either they lose their communication at a very early age, or they're born without it, and there's that very, very wrong and very dangerous assumption that they don't understand and that they're not capable of expression. It's damning. It's like, it's a serious problem that needs urgent attention and urgent awareness to change the...
I have an 11-year-old client, a boy, and he's kind of an extreme case. But he's not the only one out there. And he lives in a group home already because of his aggression. He has this same condition as our kids, but has this additional layer of pretty serious aggression and OCD. But he's such a great kid. And it took us 10 months of a lot of work, the motor therapy and communication practice, and we got to open-ended communication. And he is someone that I use physical support with, and I can tell you unequivocally, there is no way that we could have got to open-ended communication without physical support. And I know there's some methods that say you should not use it, and I do not believe that at all, because you can't make a blanket statement. Yes, you're always working towards independent communication, and that's important. It's important to use best practice for many reasons, including being able to spell with multiple communication partners. But there are some who have so much motor and sensory involvement that they cannot get started without that help with proprioception. You will leave some people behind.
Yeah.
So I remember when I found out that there were people out there actively trying to discredit this communication, and as a mother of someone who uses this, you can't imagine it's horrific, to put it mildly. It's messy. It's a messy situation because we can't unethically stop helping these people. But even though this speech profession, they should be, but they're not, and they're against it. So when they catch up, because I believe they will, I don't know what that will look like.
And they do have a role in protecting the vulnerable at these larger organizations, in theory. So in some ways there's a protective factor there.
And I'd be the first
because you put it in the wrong hands.
The risk of influence, which is what it is, intentional or unintentional, is very real.
Yeah.
And that gets taught in a reputable program that is teaching you how to support communication. That should be one of the first things that's taught, and it's a serious thing you have to be aware of so that you avoid. But the reality is there's no accountability.
So regulation of these types
important.
of alternative or complementary, because there's such a lot of wisdom and brilliance in a lot of this alternative stuff.
Yes.
Well, we call it alternative.
It's funny to call
But
it alternative,
actually,
but like
they
some
seem
of
to be the
it's-
forerunners. It's nice when the evidence-based medicine, like SLP, PT, OT, kind of take that on, you know, but just like everything in medicine too, you know, it takes years and years and years before they go, oh, okay, there might be something
it's
in
like,
this.
It's like the medical profession has to catch up to us parents on the front lines who've like
Yeah.
figured a lot out.
Oh gosh, yeah.